Terror attacks across Sri Lanka have shocked the South Asian country.
They want to begin with the horrific breaking news out of Sri Lanka, an island nation off the southern coast of India.
We begin with some breaking news out of Sri Lanka and reports of 6 bomb attacks at churches and hotels.
There have been 8 bombings overnight in and around 3 cities in Sri Lanka.
Hundreds of people have lost their lives in the horrific bombings that became the deadliest violence in the country in a decade. But after the initial reports broke on that bloody Sunday morning, troubling new details began to leak out about what Sri Lanka's security agencies knew. Details that show certain officials in Sri Lanka were warned of possible attacks, and they didn't take the steps to stop them. On the morning of Easter Sunday, at least 8 coordinated bombings ripped through Sri Lanka. Suicide bombers targeted churches and hotels frequented by Westerners. They primarily took place in the capital, Colombo, as well as other cities. At least 250 people were killed in the bombings, and hundreds more were injured. The terror attacks became the deadliest violence in the country since the end of Sri Lanka's brutal 26-year civil war, just 10 years ago. And while the country has a long history of sectarian violence, there was something different about this most recent incident.
So from the very beginning, it seemed like this was outside of local grievances, outside of the local context, and there had to be something a little bit more going on.
That's because the civil war was between the government, which is dominated by the ethnically Sinhalese majority, and a separatist militant group called the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam, or the Tamil Tigers, which was looking to carve out its own state in Sri Lanka. The Sinhalese make up nearly 75% of the country's population. Sinhalese Sri Lankans are primarily Buddhist. The Tamils represent only about 11% of the population. They are primarily Hindu and live in the country's north and parts of its eastern regions. But the country's minority Christian and Muslim populations, they were largely bystanders in that conflict. And that's why this most recent attack took some experts by surprise.
Seems very much outside of the local context. Doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense. And so from the very beginning, it seemed like there had to be some international jihadist organization at play.
It wasn't only the targets of these attacks that made the bombings suspect, but also the sheer scale and coordination of them. The local militant group allegedly responsible for the brutal attacks had never shown this level of sophistication. So it wasn't out of the realm of possibility that the group had help from an outside terror organization.
For international jihadist groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS, attacking the Christian community and attacking tourists is actually one of their big targets, and it's always been that way.
ISIS, the group that recently lost all of its territory in Iraq and Syria, claimed responsibility for the attacks. A news agency linked to ISIS released unverified footage of the purported suicide bombers standing in front of the black ISIS banner.
There's a common assumption that ISIS will claim, a literal dumpster fire or something if they could. But generally how they've worked is they recognize that ISIS media is much like any other media, that they actually have to report accurate information for people to trust what they have to say. And so generally they've been pretty accurate. What's difficult to know for sure is at what point some of these individuals in this movement made contact with the Islamic State, whether any of them traveled to Syria to fight, and whether they came back or kind of dispatched by the Islamic State to launch attacks in the West or in places like Sri Lanka.
While it's unknown if the Sri Lankan government had any knowledge of ISIS's alleged involvement, a leaked security memo shows that these attacks weren't a complete shock. Just weeks before that attack, India warned the Sri Lankan government of potential attacks. It was given detailed information, including the plan to target Catholic churches, as well as the suspected militants' names and addresses. One reason these credible warnings were not taken seriously could have been a result of the political mistrust between the president, the prime minister, and their loyalists.
There's always this assumption amongst politicians in Sri Lanka that everyone's trying to play them, that they're being they're being forced into doing something that's then going to be used as a political weapon against them. The very idea that the president was not inviting the prime minister to national security briefings and things like that, I think are quite dangerous. They should be careful not to politicize national security, right? Because national security is supposed to be above the political fray.
But experts like Amar Singham say that isn't expected as the country enters a heated election season later this year. Only time will tell if Sri Lankan leaders will put politics or national security first on their agenda, and whether their decision will cost more people their lives. The way the government responds to these attacks in the coming months will be incredibly important, and it's something we'll follow closely here at NowThis. Thanks for watching this episode of NowThis World.